Joining us today to discuss all of this are Alex Jershevsky, Managing Partner at Recovery Partners, and Richard Jenkins, Chairman and Managing Director at Black Creek Investment Management, Inc. And we hope to have from London in a few moments Michael Taylor, Senior Economist at Lombard Street Research. Welcome to the two of you fellows. Thanks for coming in to see me today.
Thank you, Howard.
So first of all, my question is the austerity program that has been outlined in Ireland. Do you think it will work, Alex?
Well, I think there's a lot of risk here, Howard, because as you know from previous conversations we've had on this topic, the key thing in these restructuring scenarios is to achieve political unity around a common goal. And one of the issues that Ireland's facing right now is that the austerity budget was delivered. It hasn't been passed yet, but already the left-wing parties are squabbling, and they're saying they're not going to support it. So if you're in that type of a situation, it's difficult to see how this program could ever survive, because what you need is continuity. You need to cross the electoral cycle. You need successive governments to support these austerity programs. You know, we're off to not a very good start, in my opinion.
Richard, your view?
Well, I guess to me the biggest issue is the fact that there's this funding gap. Ireland imported a lot of savings through the interbank market and allowed their banks to expand. There's no way to cut your way through austerity to fill that gap, because the people who lent that money have said we don't want to lend anymore. That's why the EU has stepped in. So that's the first step, but I agree. You've got to have a decent budget and a plan to get out of it.
Do you think it will pass the December 7th vote? And if it doesn't, then what?
You know, my opinion would be you just need to have a majority government of some form. We've seen that in other places, someone who will actually push through. So we may have a change in government. If you have a minority or someone where there isn't strong coalition or agreement, then you've got problems.
And so if you get another government after all of this, Alex, you know, then what happens?
Well, I mean, they've got to follow through on these plans. But at the end of the day, you've got a very, very big funding gap in that economy. You're looking at a rollover requirement over 2011 in the Irish economy of close to 20% of GDP. So they need to raise that amount of funding, plus they need to cover their budget deficit, plus they've got this funding problem with the banks that are also in trouble and are insolvent. So there has to be some mechanism to get that funding in place. The Europeans seem to think that they can do this through a bailout mechanism. I heartily disagree, because the bailout isn't going to add anything to the economy. It's basically going to replace the debt that's there with new debt.
But is it oxygen to keep the patient alive?
It'll keep it alive for a while, but at the end of the day, you need to have haircuts here. I mean, there were bad lending decisions made, and by keeping this total stock of debt intact and expecting that the Irish taxpayers are going to foot the bill to bail out banks who made bad lending decisions to Ireland, I think is a bit much.
Haircuts needed? Is that what's needed, Richard?
I think so.
To bondholders?
Well, some of it is, you have to remember, the Irish banks expanded outside of Ireland. Yes. If they had stayed within Ireland, we'd be talking about a very different magnitude of the problem. And you need some sort of stabilization package to assess what market value is, and then you can figure out what the true losses are. There will undoubtedly be pain that will be shared amongst all levels, whether it's security holders of senior debt or junior debt and the equity.
Do you agree with that, Alex, that you need that in order to...
Well, you need to go through a triage and figure out what you got. And at the end of the day, there's going to have to be a lot of pain here. There's going to be a lot of blood on the floor. What we've seen today is, up until today, is a refusal by the banks to want to take those haircuts, the banks who've lent to Ireland. And the bailout package coming out of the EU basically amounts to a bailout package for the banks that have lent to Ireland. I mean, Ireland owes, you know, on a cross-border basis to Britain, France, and Germany over 800 billion euro. This is a huge amount of money. These are huge exposures, and what the banks have done through the EU mechanism is use their political influence to get this bailout mechanism put in place so that they don't take the losses, and the losses end up falling on at the feet of the Irish taxpayer. Yeah. This has to change.
The other point I'd make is, if this were a different currency structure, say it was Canada, like 1990-91, you would just devalue the currency, and that pain would be spread to everyone who was a bondholder. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we devalued our currency in 1988 through 92, you know, by a factor of some 35 to 40%.
Right.
Everyone who held our debt got hit by that.
Can't do that in Europe.
You can't do that in Europe today. So what is the mechanism? You can't put it all on the Irish citizen, because you'll drive them to zero net worth. So it isn't going to work that way. So the pain has to be spread through Europe.
The Irish people aren't going to want to be tax slaves to the rest of Europe. And by the same token, the rest of Europe is saying, hey, if this bailout doesn't work, our taxpayers are on the hook for additional dough. We may be on the hook for additional dough if Portugal goes, if Spain goes, which is 7 times bigger than Ireland in terms of its exposures that would need to be covered. I mean, there's a serious snowballing that could occur here.
Okay. What do you think about going and sniffing around for investment opportunities there now?
Clearly, I think there should be some opportunities. I think this is a situation where you know, the normal adage is you're trying to catch a falling knife. You got to do your homework. I'm sure Richard's going to do his homework.
That's part of the trip.
Exactly. You know, you got to have boots on the ground and really see what's going on there. It is a very unstable situation. I think it's still not clear how far this contagion is going to spread. And I think the elephant in the room in all of this that no one's talking about is the fact that the U.S. is technically insolvent. They're printing money to cover their budget shortfall.
I can only go one country at a time.
I know, but 35 states. This is a convenient diversion. I mean, I'm sure the folks in Washington at the Treasury and Fed just love this news because it takes the focus off of them.
And Michael, let me go back to you here. What about Portugal? Do you think that a package will be forced on Portugal? And if that happens, will it calm people down about Spain?
I think a package will eventually have to be forced onto Portugal, yes. I mean, they are engaged in another budget austerity package today. Their debt is rising at an unsustainable rate, and their economy is insufficiently flexible to be able for it to grow out of the mess it's in. So I do think, given that we've already now had Greece and Ireland, clearly the next candidate is Portugal, and I look at the fundamentals for Portugal, and they are certainly not as good as Ireland's. The banking system is not as bad as Ireland's, but the rest of the economy, I think, is in a worse state than in Ireland. So yes, Portugal's heading for a bailout. And then the big question is Spain. Clearly Spain, as one of your guests said earlier, is much, much bigger than those other three. I think an awful lot will be done to avoid having to bail out Spain, clearly because the cost of doing so will be so huge. But Spain will have to undergo a very prolonged period of economic weakness, reducing its construction sector. I mean, in a way it's similar to Ireland in the sense that Spain did have a housing and construction boom. I don't know if any of you or viewers have been to the south of Spain recently, but it's a hideously overdeveloped part of the world. With prices are now in free fall, they have to make that adjustment. I think Spain does have the resources, it does have a relatively flexible economy to avoid a bailout. So my hunch would be Portugal, yes, but Spain avoiding it.
Richard? Portugal, yes. Spain, avoiding it?
For me, the bigger question is, if it gets going to that degree, then Italy's right behind it. You know, we just keep going.
Is that a foregone conclusion?
Well,
I mean, there's a fairly big gap, isn't there, between the spreads that Spain is facing versus Italy?
Right, but the situation, debt to GDP, et cetera, in Italy is far worse than Spain, and so you keep tacking it on, and at some point, at the European level, they're going to have to sit down and talk an awful lot about enforcement mechanisms for their monetary union. You know, they're going to have to sit down and have some sort of thing worked out. If not, then they do ultimately break up.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key issue, because when they were putting the euro together and the EU the change from the EMS back in the 90s, I mean, the two things that they didn't come in with, one was a method of fiscal control from the center. They had the Stability Pact, which mandated 60% debt to GDP ratios, 3% deficits, but they didn't have a method of fiscal control, and that's part of the reason some of these economies got out of control. Greece, it's not the situation in Ireland, that's a different problem, but they didn't have that central control, and they also didn't have a sovereign default mechanism in place. And that's one of the things that Angela Merkel is now talking about. And, you know, you need to have those frameworks in place to avoid all this uncertainty.
Spain, for instance, Italy, is that what we're talking about?
Well,
as you said earlier,
in my opinion, if Spain gets into trouble, needs a bailout, Italy's right behind, and we're into this scenario.
Yeah, well, the question really is whether these countries are going to want to continue accepting bailouts, because part of the conditionality attached to these bailouts is that you lose the ability to default. Your budget becomes controlled by the IMF and the European Central Bank. You lose spending control over expenditure policy. You're ceding your sovereignty. the default option is taken away. And some of these countries may say, well, no, we want to retain the default option, and we are stepping out. At the end of the day, there's no altruism between nations, and if one of these countries decides, well, you know, I'm not here for the long term. I'm not here for the entire ride. I've got to step aside. It could be Spain. Spain might decide, well, no, if it gets to that point.
Just about a minute and a half left. I want to follow up with you, Alex, because you brought up the United States earlier. The impact of the euro cracking on the United States and the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. dollar theoretically should be going down because of their debt issues, but if the euro cracks, everything gets distorted, right?
Well, you've got one of these situations of unintended consequences. You know, the euro cracks. The U.S. has been running a dollar depreciation policy now for the Fed has been running a dollar depreciation policy. That's one of their intentions. It hasn't been working in part because of the situation in Europe. The Fed, I think, will get what it wants. You know, won't get what it wants if the euro breaks up, and that will only increase the economic tensions between the Europeans and the Americans. The tensions right now are rather significant given the opposition to QE that's been expressed by Trichet and Schäuble in Germany and others.
Just about 20 seconds left to you, Michael, on that same question. Impact on the U.S. if the euro cracks.
Yes, bad news because, as Ross said, the dollar will go up. And one of the ways the U.S. can itself grow out of its troubles is through an export-led growth. So it wouldn't be good news for the US, but of course the good thing about the US is it's a successful and integrated monetary union, not in danger of breaking up, unlike the euro.
All right, gentlemen, we have to leave it there. Good of all three of you to join me today. We appreciate it. Thanks, sir.